So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. In this webinar, Seamus and I are going to be in conversation with LB Klein. Seamus is going to introduce LB, who is going to introduce us and give a content warning. And then we'll be in conversation. There's time at the end. We will take some questions, but if you have questions as we go along, it would be great if you could put them in the Q&A, because we're going to be developing a frequently asked questions document about the Space Toolkit. And so we'll use your questions, even if we can't answer them live, we'll use your questions to develop that. So again, thank you all for coming, and over to you, Seamus.
So it's my pleasure to introduce LB Klein, who probably is known to many of you. And Jennifer and I are thrilled that LB agreed to be in conversation with us. LB is Anna Julia Cooper Postdoctoral Fellow and an incoming assistant professor in the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work and a core faculty of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Klein's been working in various capacities to prevent and respond to sexual violence on college and university campuses for over 18 years. And if you don't already know their work, I would strongly encourage you to check it out. I'm going to throw into the chat just a link to their website. So LB, thank you so much for joining us in conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful to be here with all of you and to see some familiar names, as was mentioned before. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Jennifer Hirsch is a professor of socio-medical sciences at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health, and Seamus Khan is a professor of sociology and American studies at Princeton University. Together, they are co-authors of Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus, published by W.W. Norton. A review in Science describes Sexual Citizens as profoundly eye-opening, and the book was selected as one of NPR's best books of 2020. Before we get started, it's important to note that our discussion today of Sexual Citizens will contain descriptions of actual sexual assaults as students experienced them. This material can be hard to listen to, and we know that not in every room, virtual webinar or not, there are survivors of violence. And I will share the information for the National Sexual Assault Hotline. They have both a phone hotline as well as an online option that we will share.
Just dropped it into the chat.
Awesome, thank you. All right, to get started, we'll start by talking a little bit about Sexual Citizens, the book. We are here to also talk about and launch the toolkit. We'll start with the book. Why did you write the book?
So we wrote the book to change the national conversation about campus sexual assault. And I'm actually going to bring the folks in the webinar into Sexual Citizens by opening with a story from the book. So when Lucy started on campus, she had been pretty sheltered. She'd gone to boarding school, and she had sort of a vision of what she hoped the beginning part of school would be like socially. She wanted to meet some boys, make out, and eventually lose her virginity. And so it was pretty exciting that first during orientation week, when a girl on her hall invited her to one of the bars in the neighborhood. They were not 21, so they couldn't drink legally, but it's not that hard to get into a bar if you're a young woman in the neighborhood. And so when they were there, they met some older guys, some seniors. Scott bought Lucy some drinks. They danced. The attention from a senior felt super flattering. And so when he asked her to go back to his fraternity with him, she said yes, she wanted to go. So they left the bar and they walked up Amsterdam Avenue. As they were walking, her phone was ringing. And at first she ignored it, and it kept ringing and ringing. And it turned out that it was her friend who she had gotten that bystander intervention, and she wanted to check up and make sure she was okay. And so Scott was more interested in going where he was going, but they waited for her friend outside the fraternity, and then they went inside. Scott asked them if they'd like a drink, and they said yes. Fraternities are not allowed to serve hard alcohol, but it doesn't mean they don't do it. It just means they keep it upstairs. So they went up to the second floor in this building where they had never been and where he lived. Lucy's friend had a little bit of the drink, and she had had a lot to drink. She just passed out. And Scott asked Lucy if she wanted to go up to his room with him. And she said yes. And so they were up there in the third floor of a building where he lived, surrounded by his friends on a campus where he had been for 3 years, where she was a newcomer. And they were making out, and it was all good until he started to unbutton her pants. And she was very clear. She said, "No, don't." To which he said, "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. And when she told us that story, she had never told anybody that she'd been assaulted the first week that she was on campus. She described it to her roommate the next day as like one of those crazy things that happens when you have sex with a guy you just met, because she felt like it was her fault. And that is a hard story. And it's a story that may land with y'all in a way where your take, which is not a bad take, is that Scott is a terrible person. Certainly he did a terrible thing. And the way that story fits into the campus conversation about sexual assault usually is about finding people like Scott, holding them responsible, and getting them out of the community. Certainly, Seamus and I think that people should be accountable for the harm that they do. And yet, this is not a problem that we can punish our way out of. And so in Sexual Citizens, we radically expand the conversation about what it would be like, what's necessary to build campuses with less sexual harm, by taking a public health approach. And that means actually explaining, as you read, how campus sexual assault is built into the design of residential higher education. That doesn't mean it's intentionally built into the design, but it is part of how school is organized, which sounds super grim, right? To say it's like a built-in thing, except once you see how it's built in, you can think about building different kinds of campuses. And that's the conversation that we're here to have with you today.
Thank you. So for folks who may be unfamiliar or who it's been a long time and a whole pandemic since they read Sexual Citizens, what are some of the big take-home points of the book?
So Jennifer and I sort of center the book around three main concepts: sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies. And the Space School Toolkit draws on all of these, but it really focuses on sexual geographies. And in order to help you sort of grasp those concepts, again, like Jennifer, I'm going to just tell a story. Charisma described Columbia and Barnard, which is the space where we did the research, as white institutions. And what she meant by that, in her own language, was that it was filled with white guys who drank too much, listened to shitty music, and didn't find her attractive. And clearly, Charisma didn't find these men attractive either. And so in order to meet somebody, she ended up chatting with her roommate and meet a guy who lived in Brooklyn, about, not far away, 10 miles, but kind of a trek. And after some sort of text vetting, going back and forth with him, she decided to make the trek out to his apartment. And as she did that, it was sort of pouring rain, a terrible New York City travel day. It took her a couple hours. She was soaking wet. She got to his apartment, peeled off some of her clothes, had a drink, smoked a little bit of a joint, and then started to make out with him. And everything was good until it wasn't. And he put his hands on her body. She moved them away. He put them right back. And she said to us at this point, I never had a plan B. My plan A was body language, and it had always worked for me before. And he proceeded to assault her. Now, you read that story sort of in the same way as the Lucy and Scott story and think about, wow, that guy is a terrible human being, and we need to find him and either punish him or educate him. And like Jennifer said, not a bad read. That is something that we as communities have a responsibility to do. But in the book, Jennifer and I say that might be a place where we begin, but it isn't a place to end, in part because it doesn't have at its core a prevention mindset in place in the sort of richness of what that could be. So these three concepts, sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies, give us a kind of different lens and maybe some new opportunities for mobilization of a range of community resources to help prevent sexual violence. Sexual projects is the answer to the question, what is sex for? And you might think to yourself, only two academics could ask a question like, what is sex for? But as it turns out, sex is for a lot of different things. And what people are trying to do with their intimate lives is really important for understanding the conditions where sexual intimacy happens, and which is often a precursor to sexual violence. In the story that we tell with Charisma, the young man has a really clear sense of his own sexual project, which is to get off. And Charisma has a really impoverished sense. And that impoverishment is, in some way, we see it as like institutionally produced, that communities often create silence around sex and sexuality. The second concept, sexual citizenship, is a bit of a provocation. It suggests that people have the right to sexual self-determination and an obligation to recognize that others have an equivalent right. And we really see a kind of profound failure of sexual citizenship in that room, particularly with that young man who doesn't recognize Charisma as a kind of equivalent human being. Or if we take Scott and Lucy's story that Jennifer told, Scott, when he says to Lucy, it's okay, he's effectively saying, like, your position isn't legitimate. The final concept, sexual geographies, is really kind of the thing that we ground a lot of the space toolkit in. And this is the idea that space matters and that space is deeply intertwined with intersecting forms of power. So I open by saying, Charisma described Columbia and Barnard as a white institution or a white space, in part because what drove Charisma off campus was an experience where white men who didn't have the same socialization practices that she had, who really, a lot of their socialization was grounded in drinking, for example, they controlled most of the space on campus where socializing happened. Or if we listen to both the Scott and Lucy story and the Charisma story, one of the things that it highlights, and something that we saw again and again, is that within cis-hetero interactions, men often controlled the spaces where sex was happening in or where intimacy happened. And that wasn't just sort of a random consequence, but instead kind of a way of sort of organizing communities. And so, what we do in the book is highlight how space and power are deeply intertwined. And then in the space toolkit, we begin to think a little bit about how those things could be redesigned or what a process might look like to reimagine space, power, and inequalities on campus.
Thank you. So we're here to talk about the Sexual Assault Prevention and Community Equity, or SPACE toolkit. How did the toolkit draw upon the ideas that y'all just shared?
So when we were doing the field work, we had not just one light bulb moment, but a couple. But so I'll describe the first light bulb moment. There was an institutional advisory board that worked with the broader Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation research project that generated the research that Seamus and I share in Sexual Citizens. And one of the people on that advisory board was a vice president for housing and dining. And I think he was like, never really sure why we asked him to be on it, because he had not thought of himself as a sexual assault prevention stakeholder. He was just like somebody who was responsible for the menus and the furnishings and like every material element of campus life, but he had never made the connection. And when we were describing to him how when the bars shut down and the parties are over, students are funneled back into rooms where there are only 4 pieces of furniture, a desk, a dresser, a desk chair, and a bed. And so they end up sitting on the bed, even if all they want to do is continue the conversation. Like literally you could see the light bulb go off over him. And he was like, I could do something about that. And so he decided to keep one of the campus dining halls open all night, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, so that students would have like another place to go to eat French fries and shoot some pool and hang out. And the point is not that French fries are going to prevent every sexual assault, but that if we think about the environment as modifiable, then we can think about how to change it. The students that we worked with talked about the cafeteria workers as a really important part of the community level mental health infrastructure, that when they were sad, having somebody in the cafeteria know their name and say hello to them would cheer them up. The students talked about how strange it felt to come back to their dorm at the end of the day and see that there was a student club singing or meeting or doing their stuff in the dorm lounge, because it was literally scheduled from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And imagine how you would feel if you got home at the end of the day and somebody was working in your living room and they're like, no, you got to go back to your room because this is our space right now. And so it just came through very powerfully in the work that there were modifiable elements of space, and not modifiable through like building new buildings, but modifiable through changing the policies that determine who has access to which spaces when. So if you think about the Scott and Lucy story, that story is not inevitable in how it plays out. Many residential campuses have policies where older students automatically have more access to social space and more private living space, which means that they can host parties and have sex without having to check in with someone else. And so younger students are systematically funneled into spaces that are controlled by older students. And that power disparity, it's sort of like the power disparity between the CEO of Starbucks and a frontline barista, right? In terms of like who is in control in that moment. That's modifiable. There are also those macro level geographies that Seamus talked about, the whiteness and wealth of some of the more desirable campus party spaces. Those are things that we could change. A big point that we make in Sexual Citizens is that, yes, of course, gender inequality is one form of power that produces sexual harm on college campuses, but it's not the only form of power. And so we wanted in the Space Toolkit to give a really concrete way that campuses could have a conversation about how inequalities are built into campus life. So racial inequalities, class inequalities, and how the allocation of space could mitigate those inequalities as opposed to amplifying them.
Great. So we'll dive into the toolkit itself a little bit more specifically. So what exactly is the Space Toolkit?
So, in the last few years, Jennifer and I have been traveling around virtually and sometimes in person to a wide range of institutions, talking to them about the ideas of the book. And a big commitment of ours is not just to produce sort of frameworks of understanding, but also to engage practically with the world around us. And so as we were doing this, we began to think like, it's great to present a framework of understanding to folks, but it's not necessarily that helpful if it isn't outlined in a way that might be actionable. And so what the Space Toolkit was Jennifer and me working with two other people who, one, had a lot of experience in creating resources for communities to engage in change, and another who's done a lot of sexual assault prevention from a wide range of organizations, to sort of think about how some of the ideas of the book could become much more actionable. And it also was clear to us that to be able to do that, we couldn't just do it on the basis of, here is what you should do. Like, here are the things that we prescribe for you. In large part because we recognized that so many campuses were sort of really, really different. I remember visiting UW-Platteville and talking to them about a range of space issues that were very different than the ones that we raised, because their campus isn't all residential, for example. Many of the students commute. And so things like parking policy and when different spaces on campus were open was really important there. So an example was that, they were really happy about the range of spaces that had been made available for students who were part of an LGBTQ group and part of a Black student union. But one of the challenges was that it was in an administrative building that was closed on weekends and that was closed typically after 5 p.m. when administrators left campus to go home. And what that meant was that during a lot of socialization hours, it wasn't really available. And it made us realize that what we could hopefully do is not give, say, a set of clear guidelines or instructions for people, but instead a compilation of resources, suggestions, and ideas, really to outline a process that communities could go through that would help them use an approach that isn't just ours, but is really a wide range of researchers who think about sexual violence, not just in terms of gender-based violence, but really power-based violence, and how communities could come together to address that. So practically, what does it look like? Well, we outline 4 basic phases that communities can think about going through and provide suggestions for how to think about each phase, how to collectively have a conversation about what's happening on campus, how to engage a wide range of stakeholders, and how to begin to plan a change process. So the 4 phases are, with their 4 C's, commit, convene, consider, and change. Commit is the idea that, really buy-in from senior level administrators is important for the kind of process that we outline. It's not absolutely necessary, but really to kind of make the sorts of changes that we're imagining that this toolkit could be used for, having institutional commitment is really quite important. And so the first stage is, if you're thinking about using something like this, trying to engage with senior level administrators. And we provide resources to give to those administrators that aren't just a 40-page toolkit that might overwhelm them, to sort of help them see how this can fit in as part of a broad set of policies that campuses are doing. So I think it's also important to know that that commitment isn't, hey, we have a different program to sell into you, but instead, here's something that you can do beyond what you're already doing with, say, consent education or bystander intervention training. The second set of suggestions is to convene a group of people and a wide range of stakeholders with the power, understanding, and shared intention of redesigning campus spaces and policies governing those spaces. As Jennifer said, in a residential campus context, there are all kinds of policies about space that augment rather than moderate existing power inequalities, so that more senior people get access to better housing is a policy that builds inequality into the fabric of campus life. And there are no cost solutions to reevaluating that policy. What Jennifer and I think is that you all, who are sort of listening in on this call, you're experts in your own community. And what you're really going to have to do is get together a wide range of perspectives. Those perspectives include people who have some control over space. They also include sort of students. And one of our visions may be naive, but it's that instead of falling back into the consistent sort of oppositional dynamic between students and administrators on campus, that this project might allow for a collective commitment for the production of a shared vision of prevention. And so here, the Offices of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Title IX, facilities, housing, residential life for residential campuses, Greek Life if they have them, University Police and Public Safety, faculty, students, wellness and counseling, psychological services, institutions that focus on social power, such as a Gender and Sexualities Institute, African American, Latinx, schools of social work and public health, as well as facilities, ground management, transportation. These are all people that have some set of control over resources and how space is used on campus, and whose insights will be critical to transforming one's vision of what sexual assault prevention looks like. The third stage is consider, which is where a group of people come together and consider the problem. And the aim here is to give folks the sort of understanding overview that Jennifer and I just gave in the first kind of 15 minutes of this conversation of what the ideas of the book are. And we have online resources for that, videos, as well as stories from the book that we've excerpted as part of the toolkit, so that people can collectively see the sort of framework that we're using and then begin to deploy it in their own contexts, thinking about residential spaces, if there are them, social spaces, virtual spaces, programmatic spaces, and public spaces. And just the first step is really to just describe these things, to get a bunch of ideas out there about how space and power are intertwined. For campuses that have Greek life, for example, one of the obvious things will be how Greek life allows fraternities, male organizations, to serve alcohol and sororities not to. And there's a spatial and policy dynamic to that have implications. Once sort of everyone gets it out there and they begin to sort of consider, we suggest a process for a change plan. And really the suggestion here is to begin kind of small, but the fourth step is to think about what change would look like on campus, given the descriptions that have come from the diverse constituencies that have been brought together. In the toolkit, we also provide a sort of timeline and workflow plan for folks as they go through this, to sort of make sure that they're sort of checking, as is appropriate for their own campuses, a range of boxes. We provide tips for running meetings, so thinking about the emotional impact of these conversations, the challenges of mandated reporting, and what it means to establish a set of shared norms and language within a group. Our aim here then is to sort of provide a set of insights that communities can use and deploy to commit, convene, consider, and change as part of, in some ways, a kind of radical process of engaging in community assessment and redesign. And I'll also just say, like, it really is free. Like, there's no, Jennifer and I thinking that like we give away a free resource and then sell in other things to institutions. The hope is to have this be a free open source process where people actually then can provide some kind of feedback, and that communities can learn from one another in terms of how they're engaging with this toolkit.
Thank you. So when you were designing the space toolkit, who did you see it as for? And do you think that it provides practical guidance? And will the process that folks are engaging in, so the toolkit is free, will the process folks are engaging in be expensive?
Well, Seamus and I are so chill with such a small vision. So it's for everybody. And is it practical? It's a different approach. I think it's important to be real about that. And it's not practical if people expect to do this on top of everything else they're also doing, right? So that's the reason that it's important to get high-level administrative buy-in. I mean, one of the things that we've seen so much as we visited campus is what a heavy burden frontline prevention people carry, and how serious the problem of burnout is. So it's practical if you are supported to do this as your work. If someone will take something else off your plate. The process doesn't need to cost a lot of money. Of course, there may be some campuses who are like, we need technical assistance, so we're going to write a grant to our state coalition against sexual assault. God bless you, right? Like, if you can get resources to bring in extra technical assistance, that's awesome. Seamus and I, that's not our lane, right? Like we don't have the expertise to do that. But as we spoke with so many campuses across the country, people asked us again and again, like, make a thing. And we're like, well, we made a book. What else do you want? But they wanted like some practical thing that people could use to apply the ideas in the book. And as Seamus explained, there are three big ideas in the book: sexual citizenship, sexual projects, and sexual geographies. And of those three ideas, we feel pretty strongly that the place to start for programming is sexual geographies, because it's what's most novel and it's what maps most clearly onto a public health approach of changing the environment. Our A game in public health is not telling people to be better people. We see how well that has worked in recent years, but rather thinking about changing the environment. And so we over the process of developing it, we consulted both with a small group of sexual assault prevention experts who should not be held responsible for any weaknesses in the toolkit, and also with a number of campuses who gave us feedback on what they saw as things that they would like us to fill in or clarify, some of the feasibility challenges. What we're sharing with you is still, it's not the beta version, but it's like the beta 0.1 version. And so we're excited and curious to see how campuses use it and to learn together from you what kinds of solutions might emerge, but some specific ideas, because this is not, doesn't need to be $1 million approach. Like if you have $1 million, build a palace, that's great. But if you're not in the business of palace building, things that could be changed would be something like make changes to rooming policy so that in housing draw, you think about legally acceptable ways to prioritize students from minoritized groups, or to, seniors, they might think they're a protected class, but they are not. And so changing housing policy so that first-year students actually have access to some of those prime spaces. So just make a change in one dorm and then track the well-being of students in that dorm compared to students in another first-year student dorm. Think about creating one kind of program housing to support a particular group of minoritized students. Encourage student groups, because the students will be involved in this process. And so one way of changing the allocation of space without really challenging, or without fundamentally needing to challenge how space is distributed, is to encourage student groups that have access to a lot of space to be better sharers. There's an example in the book of a fraternity that shares their space with a Latinx group for Mexican Independence Day celebration. So even if, so you don't, I guess the take home is you don't need to build a palace. If you do build a palace, please invite us to the opening party, however.
I would like to go also. So we've talked a little bit about the approach used in the space toolkit. How do you see that as different from the prevention work that you've seen campuses doing?
Yeah, as I said before, Jennifer and I don't want to sort of overpromise or diminish the important work that's already going on. So we don't want to overpromise in terms of what this will do, nor do we want to diminish the existing programming. So the aim of this is not to say we've been doing it all wrong, but luckily Jennifer and I are here and now we can do it all right. A lot of the programming that's happening on campuses is really important. So bystander intervention is something that has been shown to have important impacts, and the consent education is absolutely necessary as part of sexual assault prevention. More than us, LB is actually someone who could tell us a lot about things that do and don't work and that have been shown to be effective, and not just concepts that have been shown to be effective, but how and when and why they're effective. But What we're suggesting is a little bit of a change in perspective, and to move away from a logic of compliance to a logic of transformation. And not everyone is going to be ready or want to do this. And the aim here is not to say, oh, don't worry about compliance. It's that compliance is the minimum bar, I think, that we can all reach, and that there are other things that we can do, and that there are other people that we can draw into this work to improve student lives and outcomes more generally. And our conceptual framework really builds upon sort of decades of research and insights within work on sexuality, on gender, and on sexual violence. And what we mean by that is we sometimes use the phrase power-based violence. So, the idea there is that, like much of the work that talks about sexual assault as gender-based violence, Jennifer and I and many other scholars note that gender isn't the only form of power inequality on campus, and that certain kinds of power inequalities can actually produce all kinds of harms like sexual violence. So, for example, in the book, to just return to it for a moment, every single Black woman that we spoke to told us a story of unwanted sexualized touching. Every single one. Many of them didn't categorize it as sexual violence, but it was an experience of anti-Black racism, of a diminishment of their autonomy over their own bodies. And we noted, as so many researchers do, the enormously elevated risk of sexual violence among the LGBTQIA communities. And what that suggests is that precarity and being in a position without power on campus puts you at risk for a lot of harms, of which sexual violence is one. So this sort of intersectional power-based inequality approach imagines bringing together sexual assault prevention and a range of actors on campus, those who are doing, for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion work that push beyond a logic of compliance to a logic of how it is that collectively there could be a shared vision of building equity into the spatial design and the spatial policy design of campus. And what this toolkit hopefully does is a set of ideas and a framework for campuses to begin a kind of reimagining. And through that reimagining, to begin kind of piloting a set of things that they might try to do in a different way. This isn't about compliance. It is distinctly not hotspot mapping, which is also an approach, because we don't sort of think about, what are the dangerous spaces on campus? But instead, how much more globally is space organized in ways that institutionalize power inequalities? So, for non-residential campuses, parking lots were something that we heard a lot about how access to transportation and who had access to transportation that was close to campus, far away from campus, if parking lots were closed at a certain time, what types of students couldn't actually socialize on campus, especially if a bus service stopped working. These are all part of an ecology of the way that power is built into the social structure of campus and the campus's relationship with its broader community, and can create a moment of reflection about how those power inequalities are producing harms and can be reimagined or redesigned to help minimize that.
Great. So, as was mentioned earlier about this being relatively new, do we have evidence that this approach works?
No. That's the short answer. Seamus and I and LB, we're scientists. We believe in testing things and doing things that work and not doing things that don't work. There is a lot of evidence that one-off interventions that tell people not to assault each other don't work. So, no, we haven't. This is a new thing, right? And our vision is that campuses that try it will learn about what works in terms of process. Like, were they able to pull in a diverse set of stakeholders? And were they able to convene a regular set of meetings? And were they able to imagine concretely a set of policies that they could change? And then were they able to make a change? And I think once we have better evidence of feasibility, our vision is to work with somebody who does intervention evaluation, which is not what Seamus and I do, to test it out. With all of the complications that would entail, because every campus is its own world. But obviously there's no one intervention that's going to fit for every campus. And so our interest really is whether this framework helps campuses approach thinking about community transformation in a more concrete way, and in a way that brings in people who have the power to make change, that the people who are doing sexual assault prevention, for all their commitment and dedication and hard work, like, they may not have that power. This is what we see all the time in public health, that the factors that shape people's health and well-being mostly are not in the control of the health department, right? Mostly it's labor policy, it's housing policy, it's every other part of the city and state and federal government. And so it doesn't mean that we should give up on public health, but that we need to work better at multi-sectoral partnerships. So the Space Toolkit essentially applies that idea of multi-sectoral partnerships to campus work. The goal is not to give more work to people who are already very overworked, but to bring in new partners and to bring in power from the top. One of the questions that we've gotten is what kind of buy-in we've seen. At this point, Seamus and I are only visiting campuses where we can meet with the chancellor or the president or the provost, because as much as we love the Jennifer and Seamus dog and pony show, we really want to be in conversation with campuses that are excited to be that campus that takes on prevention in this much more ambitious way. Campuses that are willing to go beyond compliance and think about what transformation looks like. So this is the beta test, and we would be super excited for you all to talk with the other people on your campus and think about joining in on this journey.
For campuses who use the Space Toolkit, what is your vision for what success in that process would look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think as much as Jennifer and I are talking about sort of a transformative vision, in some ways the vision is transformative. The actual thing that comes out of this process may be small, and that campuses can then iterate from those small interventions to more significant wins. So like, an intervention that we could imagine in an institution, say, for example, that has an LGBTQ center, but it's in a building that closes at 5 p.m. Like, how do you solve that problem, right? Like, is there a way to actually solve that problem so that that home for students on campus who may not feel like there's a space for them is more available? Or, so we're sort of thinking about the initial changes that people make as being modest in scope. We, as Jennifer just said, like, we don't know that this works. And Jennifer and I are very, very clear that we're not going to suggest to campuses that they do something huge and radical unless sort of they have that as a recognition that this is something that's somewhat, it's grounded in a lot of knowledge about public health. But it's not something that we have done an evaluation of. That said, I think we've pointed to a few things that I think will be important for success on campuses. The first, as I said, and as Jennifer said, some commitment from the top, I think, will be important. A second would be some dedication of human resource within this, so that the people who are enacting this don't have it as another unfunded mandate from the top, but instead certain kinds of things that they're doing as part of their day-to-day practice are taken off their plate as they begin to do something like this. That it's important to recognize that Jennifer and I will not be there with you through the process. This is a process that you undertake. It's not that we will absolutely ghost you and never talk to you, but it's like we can't make a commitment, just the two of us, to be engaged with every campus that does this. But we are making a commitment to provide some rudimentary infrastructure for campuses to learn from one another who take on this. And campuses are going to vary in their resources, in their institutional commitment, et cetera. But as we've sort of pointed to with a few examples along the way, from policies to spatial design, et cetera, I think that there are small things that campuses can do and iterate from to sort of build this process into a long-term plan for how to reimagine equity as at the center of what many of us are doing.
Awesome. So we've had some questions about this in the Q&A. What do people on this call need to do next if they want to engage further?
So we've dropped the toolkit in the chat several times, and we'll send it out also with the video, which will at that point be closed captioned. Talk about it with people on your campus. I think, one way of starting is to have a little book club and read Sexual Citizens together so that people really get the idea of sexual geographies. But if you think people are pretty tapped out from the pandemic and not reading a lot, we also have a lot of podcasts on our website. There's a 9-minute clip on what sexual geographies are. So I think it's build a team, because there's no matter how powerful any one of you is, and I'm sure that in this webinar, there are a lot of people who are individually very powerful. You can't do this as a single person thing. You need to build a team on a campus. Then think about whose commitment you need. So how do you get administrators, higher level administrators on board? And absolutely, there will be some campuses where they're just like, nope. We are sticking with the PowerPoint. We're doing the compliance thing. And then you have a choice. You could be like, okay, that's as far as we can get. Or you could say, we're going to go rogue and we're going to push this ahead, acknowledging that there are limits to the kinds of changes we can make. And we'll try a small thing, right? We'll figure out who controls this space that could be more accessible to more people. Or we're going to work directly with the housing people and see if we can get them to create one kind of program housing. One of the questions that has been dropped in the chat were just for more examples of specific things. So one specific example from a large public university of a totally student-led initiative, which I think shows that this doesn't have to necessarily have top-down support, was that there was already dedicated program housing for queer students. And there were some feelings and some incidents that queer student housing actually was not supportive for queer students of color. And so students got together and they pushed the administration to create dedicated housing for queer students of color. And was it enough for 1,000 students? No, but it was the beginning. It was a beginning of a space that was owned by one of the groups that is most minoritized on campus and that has varied rates of experiencing sexual harm as well as other kinds of harm. So that's one example. Another example, and this I think is useful because it was really driven by the people in the sexual assault prevention office at a small liberal arts college. They heard what we were saying about housing policy, and they're like, why is it that the best rooms on campus go to the seniors who are team captains of the most prestigious sports? We're going to change that. And so they changed it, and they didn't change it in the way that we would have suggested. They changed it so that those rooms went to students with the highest GPA. So we don't know what the impact of that was, but it was definitely a change. And so I think that, each campus is going to develop its own vision for solutions. And it doesn't, and so as I was saying before, you don't need to build a palace. There was a question in the chat about whether either of our universities have decided to use the toolkit and have buy-in from stakeholders. I know from a presentation that I gave at Princeton several years ago, Seamus's university, my alma mater, that as they were designing, and I mean, Princeton is sort of the paradigmatic institution that in fact is building palaces, right? So let's just call them out. But so as they were designing their 6th residential college, they took the recommendations in the book into account. So the space toolkit wasn't in existence yet, but they heard what we said about first-year students needing spaces to socialize. And the dorm hasn't been open, so who knows what it looks like, but I'm sure it's full of wonderful spaces where students can be together without needing to shuffle off into spaces controlled by older students. What we don't have the capacity for right now is some way of managing people's input and experiences. So for right now, what we're saying is if you've tried this and it's working, to share it back with us at our shared email, sexualcitizens@gmail.com. Of course, if you want to blog about it and then tag us on Twitter, that would also be awesome. One of the things, like I feel like we needed a better plan to compile feedback. So I would say stay tuned on that. And now I think we have time for a couple of questions, maybe one or two.
One question that's come up a couple of times and somewhat in response to the meeting with presidents and provosts with I don't know on my campus if I have the buy-in that even that would happen. Do you have any suggestions for pitching this approach to higher level leadership for folks who are on board, but they're not sure their broader university is?
I mean, we were asked to give the keynote at the Association of Title IX Officers this past fall. And so I think all the Title IX officers heard us. And so your campus's Title IX officer, we talked about the toolkit in that presentation. Your campus's Title IX officer definitely has the ear of whoever sits in the president's office. So they might be an ally. Like they would like for you to put them out of business, believe me. And so I think any new idea that you can bring to them, that might be one way. I don't know, Seamus or LB, if you have other thoughts about how to make this pitch.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the things is like a short one pager that also can be shared as part of that idea, so that it's not, you don't have to give a president a 40-page document. And so that's an important part of it. I think also, for some campuses, and it's not all of them, like the pitch that Jennifer and I have been giving that has worked with some presidents and provosts is like, instead of being the place that's known as where assaults happen, what if we were the place that's known to be the place that's leading on this issue, leading with new perspectives, with engaging wide ranges of stakeholders, et cetera. And I think that can be a really helpful way of sort of, especially for presidents and others, like getting a little bit of their sort of ambition and excitement behind changing the conversation about, what do we do after these things happen, as opposed to what do we do to not make them happen in the first place, and be kind of the institution that other places look to when they're asking about models for transformation and sexual assault prevention. It's 3:30. Should we wrap a little bit? So what Jennifer and I have done is captured this Q&A, and we'll end up writing out questions, answers to it. And we've also dropped into the chat a few times, both a link to the toolkit and our sexualcitizens@gmail.com address. And we would just be very excited to hear from those of you who are thinking about doing this. We'll be in touch with answers to these questions. And we want to, I want to apologize that we didn't actually think about the accessibility of this. We'll correct that for the version. And we'll also send a note to you that you can share this webinar recording of it, because it'll be posted on our YouTube channel, hopefully within a week or so. Thank you, Elby, so much for being part of our conversation and taking the time to do this, and to Drew and to Mackenzie and to folks for just engaging with this work and being on this sort of journey with us. We're excited about what's to come. Bye-bye, everyone.